Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us. Speak up. Stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KYVoice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us. Speak up. Stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
Covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
Good morning, Kentuckiana. This is your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson of the Kentucky Liberty Caucus. I'm here on Kentucky's Voice. You're probably listening to me right now on 970 AM. I want to make sure that you can reach us at all the different platforms that we're on. We're currently streaming live on Facebook. You can find that at Kentucky's Voice on Facebook. We also are on YouTube with a live stream. The clips of this show, the podcast, will be on YouTube as well. You can search for either Facebook or on YouTube for Kentucky's Voice, and you'll be able to click around on the videos and find this. We also are on TV. So if you have Spectrum Television, we're on channel 21, which is WBNA. And that is at 12:30, 4, and 8 p.m., I believe. Just check your TV guide and make sure what times. If you're watching this stream, you probably see that instead of my normal gray suit, I've got on my red shirt and a blue coat. That's an indication of that great basketball game that just happened. I'm a Kentucky fan. I'm joined by a guy, John Cox, who I think is also a Kentucky fan, but we both support Louisville whenever they're not playing UK, I think. So great win by the Cards. If we see you in the tournament, I think maybe we'll get you back. Okay, our show today is going to be about the elections that just happened in the off year. So I think they happened on November 5th, maybe. So last Tuesday, there were various elections, none in Kentucky, by the way. So if you're worried that you missed the election, your ability to vote, we'll talk about one election that is happening in Kentucky. That's happening on December 16th, though. However, politics tends to be national as well as local. And so there were several elections that mostly went in the Democrats' favor, if we're being honest. So this show is going to be talking about some of those results, putting them into context. Just how bad was the news for Republicans? Was there any good news that maybe came out of those elections? So we'll talk about that in the first segment. And then in the segments 2, 3, and 4, the rest of the show, we're going to talk about some of the economic messaging that seemed to work in this election and just generally what messaging is the Republican Party sending out to voters. And what does that messaging need to look like if we are going to be successful in next year's elections and going forward? Basically, what should the party platform be if we want to appeal to today's voters? So just to be very specific about what we're talking about, the biggest races that were decided last Tuesday were the governor's elections in Virginia and New Jersey, the mayoral election in New York City, some of the down ballot races in Virginia. There were some local races and a couple of state Supreme Court races in Pennsylvania. And there were also some ballot initiatives that occurred in Texas and California. So when you join us back after the break, we're going to talk through especially which of those things should we be most concerned about as Republicans? Which of these political figures that won elections might we need to look out for in the future? And just generally, is there a political movement that is developing in this country that might be antithetical to what we would like as conservatives for the future? I mean, is there a dangerous trend in American politics that we really need to address? I'm also going to have a little bit of discussion about what I consider the most disgusting win by the Democrats, and that is Jay Jones winning for Attorney General in the state of Virginia. So, the main key for this show is going to be, what do we need to do in order to be more successful in the more important races that are going to be happening in 2026? All right. Be sure to join us after the break as we start to get into the context of those races and how concerned we should be. I'm Dr. Lance Pearson. Join us after the break on Kentucky's Voice. Kentucky's Voice. Today we're talking about last week's election results, their implications for the 2026 elections and beyond, and maybe even some impacts on Kentucky's politics, given that a lot of politics are national or international even, and not just local. So the first thing that we want to talk about is just which of these races should we be most concerned about? Which of these results? It was definitely a good day for Democrats. We don't want to sugarcoat anything. I want to give you a realistic perspective of what happened. But this first segment, I'm really going to focus in on context. So if you are unaware, Democrats won all three of the statewide races in the state of Virginia. That's the governor's race, which is currently held by a Republican. But Abigail Spanberger actually won as a Democrat in that race against a woman named Winsome Sears. They also won the Attorney General race and the Lieutenant Governor race in the state of Virginia. I think they also picked up about 13 House seats at the state legislature level because Virginia has a lot of elections in this off-year cycle. In New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill beat Jack Ciattarelli for the governor of the state of New Jersey. Zohran Mondami won the New York mayoral race, defeating most closely Andrew Cuomo, as well as the Republican candidate, Curtis Sliwa. And then in Pennsylvania, there was a little bit more of a mixed story. I believe the state Supreme Court races, there was a vote on the ballot that called for them to be recalled. All three of them are Democrat Supreme Court justices. Those failed, so those Democrat Supreme Court justices, I believe, are going to stay in office for at least the next 8 years or so. But the Republicans did pick up, I think, 3 House seats in the state of Pennsylvania, so it wasn't totally Democrat leaning. In Texas, there were, I believe there were at least 17 ballot measures, which are roughly the equivalent of a constitutional amendment in Kentucky, that were proposed by the Republican legislature. Those passed with pretty clear majority. So in Texas, the story was largely successful for Republican ideas. There weren't so many candidates on that ballot, but there were various ballot initiatives. And then in the state of California, you may have heard this, the voters of that state had to vote on a proposition that would allow them to redraw the congressional maps in this mid-cycle redistricting so that they could basically draw in 3 more House seats for the state of California. That succeeded, not overwhelmingly, but enough that it was successful. So I would consider that also a win for Democrats. Okay, So, how bad is the story? I want to put this into context on two levels, really. Number one, geography. Almost all of these races, except for the ones in Texas, and then Pennsylvania is pretty purple at this point, but certainly Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City, and then California are overwhelmingly Democrat. So Democrats did have a very good election cycle, but it was largely focused in those states that are already very blue leaning. In the states that are either red or purple, it was much more mixed. I'd say it was a win for Republican principles and conservative principles in Texas, and then it was a mixed bag in Pennsylvania. So that's the first is geography. Where were these elections held? The Democrats did very well. They exceeded even expectations in the blue areas, but they maybe underperformed, and Republicans did as well or better than they expected in the red regions. Also, we want to remember that this is an off-cycle election. If you know a lot about elections, there are basically three general categories. There are presidential election years, which tend to have very high turnout, often somewhere in the 60 or even higher range, 60% of people voting in those elections in presidential years. In the midterm elections, which are 2 years after those presidential elections, where we tend to vote on, we do vote on House of Representative members, and then often we will vote on U.S. Senate members. Those tend to have the second highest turnout. Those can be somewhere in the 50 or 40% turnout range. And then on these odd years, where it's an odd numbered year, some states will have some elections. For example, although there's none this year, 2 years from now in an odd year, Kentucky tends to have their congressional officers, like their governor elections, their lieutenant governor, the state ag commissioner, the treasurer, the auditor, those sorts of elections. Those often happen in Kentucky in those odd years as well. Now, the turnout in some of these can be as low as 20-30%. People just don't get as excited for those races when there aren't those federal elections going on, and they tend not to turn out. There's also another type of election that we may get into at the end, and that's a special election where we just all of a sudden have an election to fill a seat that got vacated, and the turnout in those elections can be as low as like 8%. So we may get into some of that later. Now, what was the turnout story? Well, I would say in general, the story is that in those blue areas, there was exceptionally high turnout for an off-year election by Democrats in those blue areas. The turnout by Republicans, however, were basically consistent with where they usually are. So what we saw is in these blue areas, basically Democrats flocked to the polls and the Republicans turned out at the rate they normally do. So it wasn't necessarily a case of Republicans being totally demoralized and not showing up at all. In fact, in New Jersey, there was actually an increase in the number of Republicans that voted in this election from the last cycle when they barely lost the governorship. But there was a major increase in the turnout for Democrats, the Democrat governor, Mikey Sherrill. In the city of New York, you saw a very similar story. Democrats had huge turnout. I believe there was higher turnout in this election in New York City than in any election in New York City for a mayoral race since 1967, I believe. Over 2 million people just in the city of New York voted in this general election. Now, there are various stories of why that turnout was so high. Some explanations that I have heard is there was excitement among young people in particular for the message of the socialist/communist messaging by Zoran Mondami. We'll talk about that more in our future segments when we talk about some of the economic messaging that came out. In Virginia, there was a stimulation of people on the Democratic side by a lot of the government shutdown and the government layoffs, the DOGE cuts, those sorts of things. The Trump administration has made pretty substantial cuts to the number of headcount in our federal government, which for us, that's fantastic. But in Northern Virginia, where by far the biggest employer is the federal government, it's basically the DC suburbs, there were a lot of people that had their jobs slashed or who were, at least had uncertainty. And certainly because we had this shutdown happening at the time, a lot of those people weren't getting their paychecks. Now, that includes both military. Virginia is home to several military bases, but also all those government contractors, a lot of the government workers. A lot of areas of DC aren't particularly safe, so you'll see a lot of those DC workers actually live in Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland, or south of Baltimore. So there were some local issues that basically were really triggering, if you want to use that term, triggering for Democrats. And so it wasn't only just that the messaging was great. There were also some particular localized reasons that there was extremely high Democrat turnout in that election. Now, why was there not spectacular Republican turnout in those elections? We'll talk about some of the Republican messaging, but one of the factors that I think depressed some of that Republican turnout, and again, it was basically at the same level as usual, is that the governor candidate for Republican in Virginia previously had made some pretty public and pretty vehemently, let's move on for Trump sort of messaging. So Trump, I believe he did eventually endorse her, but it was extremely late in the race. So a lot of the rural vote, for example, in Virginia, which still, don't get me wrong, most of the rural parts of Virginia still were red, but the turnout wasn't what it needed to be in order to counteract those urban populations that voted Democrat. And part of that, at least in Virginia, I believe, was a lot of the people that show up only for Trump really didn't see her as a pro-Trump type of candidate. And so I think that was one reason that she wound up losing by the largest margin that I at least have on record going back to 1977. She lost that race by 14.4%. The closest loss by a Republican was in 1985, and that was 10.4%. So she did not do well. Let's just be very frank about that. Okay. In our next segment, we're going to talk about some of the messaging that has come out of these elections and how the Republicans need to do a better job of appealing, especially on economics, to younger people if we want to win elections. We'll also talk about Jay Jones. Join us after the break on Kentucky's Voice.
Are you ready to stand for truth? Kentucky is at a crossroads, and we need voices that won't back down. This is your moment to rise, speak up, and be part of a movement that's changing the narrative in the Commonwealth. Kentucky's Voice is calling on bold citizen journalists, fearless editors, and those unafraid to speak truth in the public square. Volunteer, intern, contribute. Scan the QR code or visit kyvoice.org to join the fight. This is more than media. This is your moment. You are Kentucky's voice.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson with the Kentucky Liberty Caucus. Today we're talking about the last elections results. And don't worry, we didn't have one in Kentucky, but we're talking about national implications and maybe the implications for next year's elections in particular in Kentucky. We talked through some of the context. It was definitely a good night for Democrats, but there are reasons that we shouldn't fear. For example, a blue wave is coming in 2026. We'll see, and we'll try to discuss over the next few segments what Republican messaging and policy needs to look like if we want to win those elections in the midterm and maybe the next presidential election in particular. In this segment, I want to lead off with what I consider the most horrendous result of the 2025 election season, and that was the success of Jay Jones in the state of Virginia winning the Attorney General spot, which is essentially the highest ranking law enforcement officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. He beat the current Attorney General, Jason Miseris, by I think 6 to 8 points. And many people thought that race was going to be very close. And what made that race especially, even though there was a tendency to have a little bit of a blue wave in Virginia specifically, the reason people didn't think that would be such, that they thought that would be a close race and not a blue wave election in Virginia was this happened about 2 or 3 weeks after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And there was a lot of discussion about political violence. Maybe it was a month after Charlie Kirk's assassination. And it came out right before the election that Jay Jones had made some just appalling, atrocious text messages that got leaked to the press and exposed. So the voters of Virginia were well aware of the things that he said. So let me just give you the context of that. Jay Jones was a former state legislator. He was texting with the Republican state delegate, and her name was Carrie Coyner. But it was about the then Virginia House Speaker Todd Gilbert. So he was making these text messages mostly about the Speaker of the House, Todd Gilbert. Earlier than he started sending these texts, another state legislator who was a Democrat named Joe Johnson Jr., who was a moderate Democrat, died. The Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, Todd Gilbert, made some very favorable comments about him. Basically, this guy had just died. He was a former legislator, and he basically just made some comments that he was a very stand-up individual, the normal stuff that anyone would say after the death of a former colleague. Jones then went into a tirade to this other state delegate where he disparaged Joe Johnson's political centrism. He scoffed at all these tributes that the Republicans were saying after his death and basically just complimenting the guy after his death. And here are some of those. Let me just go ahead and read some of the things that he said. He said, "If those guys die before me, I will go to their funerals and pee on their graves. I will send them a wash in something." The person that he was texting with, this other state representatives, basically called him out by name, like, "What are you talking about?" He then texted, "If there were 3 people and I had 2 bullets, and those people were Todd Gilbert, Hitler, and Pol Pot, Gilbert gets 2 bullets to the head." I mean, just listen to that. That's disgraceful. "Put Gilbert in the crew with the 2 worst people that you know, and he receives both bullets every single time." This person texts back and says, "Jay, please stop." He says, "It really bothers me." She said, "It really bothers me when you talk about hurting people or wishing death on these people." He said, "I understand. I wasn't attacking you. I was trying to understand your logic." And then some other stuff. He said that he wished that Todd and Jennifer, so Todd Gilbert and his wife, that they would experience their own children being killed so that they would understand the policy proposals that he had. He then said, "Do I think that Todd and Jennifer are evil and that they are breeding little fascists? Yes, I do." Okay, so right after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it comes out that this guy was making messages about his political opponents where he was saying he would murder them in a shooting lineup, that he hoped that their children would be killed, and that they are bringing up little fascists. Their children are little fascists. And the voters of Virginia decided that was appropriate enough that they're going to elect this guy to replace the sitting attorney general and make this guy the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Virginia. So all of these other elections, people's jobs were lost because of Doge cuts, or there was maybe there was a government shutdown and they were worried about their paychecks, or even there's some socialist economic messaging that may have appealed to some young poor people in New York City. I can understand all those. What I can't understand is the voters of Virginia basically endorsing this sort of political violence by putting a guy that made these appalling comments, and they were well aware of this. For 3 weeks ahead of this election, this was all over the news. So anybody that was going to vote was very well aware of what was said in these text chats. And the governor of Virginia, who wound up winning by 14.5 points, refused to pull her endorsement of him. So she didn't necessarily back any of his comments. They obviously were horrendous, but she also didn't pull her endorsement. Okay, in these next segments, we want to talk a little bit more about that messaging. In particular, I want to talk about the appeal of Zohran Mamdani, who is a Ugandan immigrant. He is Muslim, which is fine. There's no religious tests for public office in the United States, but he was an avowed quote-unquote democratic socialist, which is really a code word for communist. I believe he was openly communist in his rhetoric, talking about the seizure of private property and making it a public asset. He basically endorsed the entire agenda of Marxism. And he won election over Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, and I believe he won by about 8 points, and most of that was not at all the Republicans refusing to back Cuomo against him. I believe the Republican candidate, who was polling in the 20s after Trump said, go ahead and vote for Cuomo, his support dropped below 8%. So it wasn't a matter of Republicans backing Mamdani. So what are some of the economic messages that appeal to the people of New York that Mamdani was spreading? I want to bring on my guest, John Cox. Can we put him on screen? So John Cox, if you want to reach out to him on Twitter, he's at way too much JRMC on X, what used to be Twitter.
Yes, sir. Yep.
And you can also find him under John Ross, I believe, on Facebook if you want to if you want to reach out to him. So, John, we only have about a minute and a half in this segment, but we will pick it up after it. What were your thoughts on the economic messaging there, and what Republicans need to start addressing?
Well, since we only have a minute, here's what I'm going to start out saying is Charlie Kirk discussed Mamdani before his death, and this is what he had to say about him. He said, "This is yet another distress signal by young people to say, hey, if you're not going to fix our life economically, we're going to get very radical politically." Okay, and this is kind of, I'll set up the next segment with this. This has been the messaging we've heard from Trump and other Republicans over the last week, specifically if anybody watched the Ingram angle the other night where Trump was interviewed by Laura Ingram. This is basically what we heard. We heard, you're too dumb to build things. We need 500,000 H-1Bs a year to fill these jobs. You're too dumb for college. We need 600,000 Chinese to fill the school slots. You're too poor. Here's a 50-year mortgage and a one-time petty check for $2,000 from tariffs. You're not struggling financially. What are you talking about? The stock market is doing great. Oh, wait, but here's my new gold-plated room in the White House. Check this out. Right. To me, that's the breakdown that we have here. And it's not a blue wave. It's just that we're getting off message.
Right. 100%.
We need to get back to America first, affordability, America first, no more foreign entanglements, free speech, bring back meaningful jobs. That's all we got to do. Right. And we're fine. So.
All right. That was a great intro into our next segment. Come on back after the break where we talk with John Ross, Marcus Cox. about more of that economic messaging, especially that Republicans need to embrace.
To Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson. I'm here with my special guest, and that is John Ross Marcus Cox. You can reach him on X or on Facebook. Way Too Much JRMC, and the 2 is the number 2 instead of spelling that out. Way Too Much JRMC. At the very end of the last segment, you heard a very fiery, we'll call it a rant, but nevertheless, a very passionate plea for the messaging that has come out from Republicans about how to address some of the economic woes, especially of our younger people. And I agree wholeheartedly with it. If we don't appeal to young people and the economic concerns that they have, because at the end of the day, a lot of voter behavior can be determined by 2 things: what's your party affiliation, and how do voters view the candidate as affecting their own personal kitchen table issues. Those are really what drive most voting decisions, and whether a person decides to get up off of that couch and go talk and go vote, make their voice heard. So I want to intro this segment by reading a email that was sent in 2022 by a billionaire investor by the name of Peter Thiel. You probably have heard of him as a major donor to Trump. J.D. Vance actually worked for him at one point, and he was very influential in getting J.D. Vance appointed as the vice presidential candidate. He was messaging to Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, and some other Facebook executives, and he had this quote in one of his emails when they were discussing the rise in popularity of socialism among millennials and then the next generation, Gen Z. And he said, "But when 70% of millennials say that they are pro-socialist, we need to do better than simply dismiss them by saying that they are stupid or entitled or brainwashed. We should try and understand why they feel that way. And from the perspective of a broken generational compact, there seems to be a pretty straightforward answer to me, namely that when one has too much student debt, or if housing is way too unaffordable, then one will have negative capital for a long time and or find it very hard to start accumulating capital in the form of real estate. And if one has no stake in a capitalist system, then one may very well turn against it. So I think that actually echoes a lot of the points that John Ross Marcus Cox was making in our last segment. And you're hearing this from one of the most powerful men in the world and a billionaire venture capitalist. So basically, this isn't one man's opinion. This is actually some knowledgeable people at all areas of the Republican thought infrastructure, the intelligentsia, if you will. So let me bring back on John Cox. Just tell me a little bit more about what you see as the problem with current Republican messaging around millennial and Gen Z, basically young people's concerns about the economy, and what that messaging really needs to look like if we want to get them as voters.
So let's just start out with what make America great again is. And Tucker, I thought Tucker Carlson on Twitter the other day had a very good, succinct definition of it. MAGA is 5 things. It's America first, period. No pointless wars, period. Bring back meaningful jobs. Tackle immigration, both legal and illegal. And that's another thing we can talk about that Charlie Kirk was very big on as well. We don't just have an illegal immigration problem. We also have a legal immigration problem. Mm-hmm. And then free speech. But I just want to give you some of the numbers here. So he said when 70% of millennials are pro-socialist, it's actually 75% of voters under the age of 30 voted for Mamdani. So we're talking about three out of 4.
Now that's in New York City.
In New York City, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
48% of Gen Z adults don't feel financially secure. It's a Business Insider statistic. 55% of Gen Z adults list either cost of living or unemployment as their main concern. This one here is staggering to me. 60% of graduates, according to a survey in June, were still looking for their first jobs. That's from The Guardian. Does that sound like we need to be importing 500,000 people to take jobs in America? It does it to me. This one right here is also scary. The median age of first-time homebuyers has jumped to 40 years old. The median age was 33 just 5 years ago. And then the share of home purchases by first-time buyers has plunged to 21%, the lowest on record. So it's very much echoing what he said. When you don't have a stake in the capitalist system, you're going to turn against it.
Right. And
I think that's what we're seeing here is that the message from a national politics standpoint is being drug right back in that direction that I talked about before we started here, of the way George W. Bush did, where it went from his whole platform was domestic issues, and all of a sudden 9/11 happens, and all it is foreign wars for the next 8 years. I see the same thing happening now. We're still funding Ukraine. Everybody's talking about the funding to Israel, all this stuff. We're sending money down to Argentina for beef, and that's one thing Thomas Massey's talking about. And so we're not focusing on the young people. And if we don't focus on them, they're going to turn against us. And Charlie Kirk tried to warn us about it and said, this is just a distress signal is all it is.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I think those are fantastic points. I do want to emphasize Trump in that interview with Laura Ingraham was just making the point. There are some jobs that we don't have skilled Americans that are able to fill those. And so maybe some legal immigration makes sense in those cases. But if the primary problem that we're having right now is inflation is causing all of our bills to rise and our wages are not rising at the same rate, how is bringing in millions of people, whether it be illegal or legal immigrants, going to help with wages? That was the point that Laura Ingraham was making in that clip. And so I think ultimately what we need to be doing is worrying about how do we get better jobs in the United States. And certainly Trump is making the argument that eventually the tariffs are going to lead to that. It's going to cause more companies to start businesses here. Hopefully those will be filled by American citizens. That's the argument we're making. And maybe some very high skilled immigrants that we don't have the personnel in order to fill. So we're not totally anti-immigration. But if your platform, when you were talking about America first and you were talking about the financial security of American citizens, if that's now migrated to how do we get more legal or illegal immigrants into the country to depress wages, I think you've totally lost the plot. And that's not what your voters voted for. Let's just be very frank about that. When we hear about we're worried about the cost of beef, and the solution isn't we're going to figure out ways to have our own farmers produce more beef, and so we have better profits for cattle farmers. I talked about this in the previous show with Andrew Simpson, and you can find that on our channel for rural issues. But if the solution is we're going to prop up Argentina's beef markets by buying more of their foreign beef rather than helping our own cattle ranchers, how does that make any sense? How is that America first? It doesn't make sense. Let's be very frank about that.
Well, look, here's the deal.
Yeah.
So this is one other thing I have from Charlie Kirk. This was 6 things he laid out as far as things that we needed to urgently do to restore the social compact. He's got mass deportations, stop the H-1B scam. Jake Posobiec did a poll earlier today. It had 20,000 or 15,000 votes whenever I headed over here. 97.5% said that they wanted America to focus on American workers. I think that's easy.
That's right.
So let's give Americans the chance to fill those jobs first before we start, because there's even stories of American workers losing their jobs to H-1B workers because they can pay them less money.
That's right.
I mean, this is documented stuff here.
Right.
He also says,
and let me just jump in and we can pick it up right after that. Another issue with H-1B isn't only that they will work for less. When you come in over with an H-1B visa, it's extremely hard for you to leave the company that you're at without getting that visa revoked. So essentially, and a lot of tech firms are really the ones that are exploiting this the system of H-1B visas. They basically have these people in a situation where they can't leave their company. It's like indentured servitude. So rather than hiring an American worker who's going to get a competitive wage, you're going to bring up our standard of living, you're essentially hiring, and I hate to use the word slave, but you're hiring an indentured servant that can't leave your company and basically has to work for you for multiple years at that depressed wage. So go ahead and pick up.
so then we had dramatically reduced legal immigration. Again, this isn't me speaking. This is Charlie Kirk. In-chain migration, the visa lottery, build 10 million homes for Americans, individual Americans, not LLCs and BlackRock and State Street and the big hedge funds. And then this is another one, crush the college cartel. That was one of the big things that Charlie Kirk, one of his biggest messages, and one of the things that really kind of upset me the other night in that Laura Ingraham interview was this idea that we need 600,000 Chinese to fill the slots in these colleges, whenever that's literally what we're saying is that the colleges are the problem.
Right.
If they're only going to be propped up by Chinese nationals and by government guaranteed loans,
Right.
then what are they really doing? And you and I both know we've been in this education fight for years now. We're literally saying they are the problem.
Yeah.
So let's let them figure it out.
Right.
If that's really the only thing that's propping them up, then I think Laura Ingraham said good.
Right. Well, I mean, just like any other business, higher education operates on supply and demand. So if there are fewer students that are coming in from China or wherever else, India, that means that there's going to be less demand for those slots. And what is the number one problem with our college system? And we can get into what they're teaching and whether or not it's consistent with American values or conservative values. The number one problem with our college system is how expensive it is. Inflation in higher education and the healthcare system has outstripped every other field for the last 30 or 40 years. And that's because the government overly regulates it, and they provide essentially long-term, low-cost loans that people get locked into, and it allows young people to get locked into massive amounts of college debt for an education that isn't paying off on the back end. They're getting that, they're going through that college, and at the end of that, they've paid hundreds of $1,000s in payments to those schools. They're not able to file bankruptcy and even get rid of that debt. That debt will is not wiped out by a bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So that's basically with them the rest of their life by federal law. And now you're telling them, all right, we want you to start a family. We want you to buy a home. We want you to have lots of kids. We want you to engage in our community, even though you're in massive debt. You've got payments that basically you can't make ends meet. You may even be on food stamps after getting a college degree.
Well, here's one of the scariest stats I didn't say. It's only 10% of 30-year-olds are married and own a home. Yeah. I think that basically tells us everything we need to know on who we need to focus on.
All right, after the break, we're going to be joined by an honored guest, Calvin Leach, who is running for an office in Louisville.
Kentucky's Voice is your home for real news, real people, and real answers. But we can't do it without you. Your financial support helps us bring truth to the forefront, hold leaders accountable, and give a voice to the people of the Commonwealth. Join the fight today. Give online at kyvoice.org or text KY Voice to 53555. Every gift makes a difference. Stand with us, speak up, stay strong. You are Kentucky's voice.
Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. I'm your special host, Dr. Lance Pearson of the Kentucky Liberty Caucus. I do want to give a quick plug to this radio station, this ministry. If you want to give to support our programming, which is conservative discussion of conservative issues, you can go to the website kyvoice.org, not .com, .org. So we would love to have you support this ministry if you want to have more programming like this. All right. We actually have been joined by a slightly surprise guest, and that is a candidate for an election that's happening in Kentucky this year. It's happening, the actual election day is December 16th, with early voting starting in 2 weeks before that, and then in-person early voting on the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before December 16th. That candidate is Calvin Leach. Calvin Leach is running for Kentucky State Senate in District 37, which encompasses most of the South End. I briefly had Calvin on remotely earlier, but I couldn't think of a better person to bring on in our discussion of young people, the issues that are affecting their lives, and how the Republican Party can reach out to those people and maybe try to alleviate some of the economic stress that these people are feeling, than Calvin Leach. And if you see us on radio, Calvin is a young guy. He actually ran for this seat against David Yates. David Yates has moved on to be the Jefferson County clerk. And so there's a special election to fill that seat for the next year. There will eventually be an election next year for the longer term, 4-year term. But this will cover the budget cycle, very important. And so anyway, I just want people to be enthusiastic about this race, because this is a great chance to pick up this seat, which I don't believe Republicans have ever won, but this is the best chance we've ever had. So Calvin, why don't you tell me a little bit about your campaign, and especially emphasize some of the things that you think would be helpful to lowering some of those housing costs, and basically addressing some of these economic needs that young people in particular, but really people in the South End all need to have addressed. So go ahead.
Well, first off, thanks for having me, Lance. And yeah, there's certainly a lot of issues that need to be addressed across the board, not just for young people, but for everybody. But what we really need to focus on is tax reductions, specifically as it pertains to property tax. We need to look at reforming the tax code. I like what happened last year with the passage of House Bill 60, which I believe eliminates the state portion of vehicle registration tax. I think that's a good start. But what I really want to do, and this is the focal point of my campaign, I want to eliminate property tax outright for seniors, vets, and disabled folks. We need to take a hard look at doing that, and we need to also pass that homestead exemption on to everybody else. I think that would really help Kentuckians keep more of what they earn, especially in this economic environment where inflation has cooled, but that just hasn't quite been reflected in the cost of living.
Right.
And, you know, when you look at these left-wing news outlets like the Kentucky Lantern, they say things like the state's going to be operating on a tighter budget this year because of Donald Trump's federal trade policy and because of the One Big Beautiful Bill. That's just a bunch of nonsense. The One Big Beautiful Bill is actually going to significantly reduce taxes for low-income families. For those that make less than $50,000 a year, they're going to see a 14.9% decrease on federal income tax. So that's going to be huge. And it's actually going to increase taxes on the top 10% of income earners. They're going to see a 6.6% increase. So that's actually something that the left wants to see, but they won't give Donald Trump any credit for things that get done to help out the working class. But that's one thing that I really want to focus on, and it's something that we need to take a hard look at going into 2026.
Right. Now, those aren't the only issues, of course, and Calvin has actually joined us in a previous show if you want to find that one. But I'm sure you mentioned in that crime was going to be a focus also of your next session. So you want to talk a little bit about that, education, any of those other policies beyond taxes. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's so much to be addressed when it comes to crime, and there's a lot of different approaches that we've taken. I mentioned last time that we need to consider deploying the National Guard MPs alongside the LMPD just to kind of assist them until they can get the numbers back up to a point where they can handle the volume of crime. And that's actually a last resort on my agenda behind other things like the implementation of a temporary KSP outpost. I'm not opposed to flock cameras being placed around the district. There's a few Metro Council members that have done that, and I think that would help out with things like crime mapping, where we not just can ID the perpetrators, but also pinpoint what parts of town are more susceptible to home invasions, what parts of town are most susceptible to carjackings, where the drugs are going in and out. It'll give us the ability to notice these patterns and react to them accordingly. Right. And I also want to mention that the LMPD is currently dabbling in facial recognition technology. I've been kind of reading up on that, and I think it's a worthwhile investment. Some of the case studies that I was reviewing, every single one of them produced a margin of error rate that was no greater than 0.1%. So from a statistical standpoint, if you have a set of 1,000 images, it's going to positively ID at least 999 of those. So I think it's something that LMPD officers need to deploy. They should be trained on how to use it, and I think it would help them solve crime expeditiously, and so they don't get so backlogged with cases, especially at a time where their numbers are so significantly down.
Okay. Well, we can have a longer discussion about some possible constitutional issues with that. We won't get into that right now. But nevertheless, like strategic deployment of flock cameras, I don't think many people are that opposed to. I don't particularly like them capturing the location of all of the people who are completely innocent of crimes. Nevertheless, now, one other aspect that I really want to focus on economically, if Calvin were to win this seat, and I'm very hopeful that he will, we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the big benefits is Calvin is a Republican. He's entering a Senate where there are 32 Republicans of the 38 seats. Now, if a Democrat wins this seat, do you think that the 32 out of 38 Republicans are going to take the ideas of the Democrat and implement those, or do you think it's much more likely that good ideas that come from a Republican are going to get out? We're just talking about the practical effect of these elections. A Republican like Calvin is going to be able to bring money back to his district far more than any Democrat, no matter who that Democrat is. I think maybe David Yates, for example, in his last two sessions got maybe one bill passed. A Republican is going to be able to have the voice of that caucus, which is actually making the decisions in our state legislature. You want to talk about that advantage of electing a Republican to this seat over a Democrat?
Well, the thing about this seat and why it's so important is we have a GOP supermajority in the state legislature. And if you elect a Democrat to this seat, the best that he could do is pass bills that are bipartisan in nature. Any bill that he does get passed, the provisions of that are going to have to be tailored significantly to the liking of his Republican colleagues. And they're just not going to be as amenable to him as they would be one of their own.
Exactly.
So I would be much more susceptible to getting bills passed that are going to actually get things done for the South End and get things done for this state as well, whereas my opponent would just be taking up a seat.
That's right. And why would you vote for a person in the South End? The South End of Louisville needs resources from the state. Why would you vote to continue a Democrat in that seat who basically can't get anything done? Now, why is this? I want to talk a little bit about why this is a fantastic opportunity for Republicans to actually pick up this seat. This is, as we talked about earlier in the show, a special election. I don't believe that there's going to be turnout, certainly not higher than 15%. I would be surprised if it was actually above 10% of voters coming out to this election. And so if we just basically turn out the Republican base in the South End, which has grown dramatically in the last decade, we can take this seat, and then we'll have an incumbent in that seat and able to basically continue running for that seat as with the advantages that all incumbents have. So just talk a little bit about that, why it's so important to turn out, what's the dates that are important for this, what's your pitch to get people off the sofa for 5 minutes to go vote on those days that you can go vote. Go ahead.
Well, I want to highlight the dates first so I don't forget. So Election Day is December 16th. You can early vote on the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th. But the reason why this election is so important is because it presents a very unique opportunity to do something that we haven't done since 1948. This district has not been under Republican control in over 70 years. So we have a very good opportunity in front of us to get that done. We are the underdogs. I won't try to deceive you about that, but the dynamics of a special election are a lot different than a general election cycle because there's a lack of awareness. It's an off-cycle year. Anything can happen. And what we're really focused on is just trying to get those high-propensity Republican voters and independent voters out to vote and do something that hasn't been done in a while. And I also want to add that if we can take this seat, it would be huge because we would have GOP representation over about 90% of the South End.
Right.
And,
which would be amazing.
Yeah, and as far as the incumbency factor goes, the district is 65% blue. So when I'm up for re-election, if I were to actually win this seat, we would still have a pretty tough battle in front of us because the big blue sleeping giant would be awake at that point, and they would know that a Republican is in charge, and they would probably be motivated to try to get rid of him. So I would have a lot of work to do on the ground, reaching out to these Democrat voters over the 3 years that I'm in office and trying to build bridges with them and convince them that I'm on their side.
Right. Absolutely. Now, one thing that you can do to help out Calvin right now is this election is happening in a month. I want to repeat that. This election is happening in 1 month. Calvin is having 2 fundraisers, and you can also go to his website in order to donate to his campaign. His website is Calvin Leach, LEACH.com. You can donate there. Tell us a little bit about there's going to be some discussion at the Tea Party meeting, which is tomorrow, Thursday at 6:00 at Roosters on Shelbyville Road. And then tell me about the other fundraiser that you're going to be at next Tuesday, right?
Yes, it's going to be out at the Southwest Louisville Conservative Coalition, which is at the VFW 1181, I think.
It's on Blevins Gap. Blevins Gap. Right.
Yes, it's in Deep Valley Station. It's the only VFW post in that neck of the woods. That's where we have all our Southwest Louisville Conservative Coalition meetings. So it'll be there. It'll be starting at 6 p.m. and it'll feature guest speaker Dan Symes, Senator.
Okay. If our listeners will give $1,600 over the next week to Calvin, I'm going to match that with $400. So please go to calvinleach.com, give to his campaign, and support Republicans in the South End.